My name is Dr. Craig Weiner. Everybody keep coming in, welcome. So thank you for coming to the Transformational Dialogues. It is really a pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. The name of tonight's talk is Non-Local Consciousness, Exceptional Experiences, Genius, Religious Epiphany, Near-Death, and Psychic Phenomenon. We're going to be here for 4.5 hours tonight. So if you had anything scheduled, like to get to bed on time, forget about it. As far as a biography, I could be here for 10 minutes. He's the senior, he's a Samueli Fellow for the Brain Mind Healing Research Association. He's the columnist for the Explorer Journal. He's certainly the editor of the Schwartz Report. How many people get the Schwartz Report? It's an amazing publication. It basically is a daily report that he puts together, trends on education, politics, food, so many different, a wide array of trends that are going to affect us. It's absolutely free. It's just by donation, basically, to help support its ongoing daily. I don't know how he does it, but he does. And every day I look forward to them, or they build up and I read them all at once on Sunday. It's like my Sunday paper digitally. Stephan has been involved in the exploration of psychic phenomenon and non-local healing, and is really remote viewing. He's been involved with for what, 35 years or something crazy? 40 years. So we are so blessed to have him. We don't have to go to Esselen or the Omega Institute or travel to Amsterdam to hear Stephan speak. He lives here. And so it really is with deep friendship and appreciation and gratitude that I get to welcome Stephan here. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. So if we give a little round of applause. Oh, this is hard to even know where to start with a title like that. But here's what I approached Stephan with. I said, this year what I'd like to focus on is the extraordinary. Right? So what is it that is happening simultaneously on a plane other than most people are cognizant of, that sometimes we have experiences of tapping into, some people more than others. Some might think it's by luck, some might think it's by practice. And so we're just going to explore that other realm on different levels. And we've had some wonderful conversations on Stephan's fascination with near-death experience, and somehow we're going to tie all of these together within the next 90 minutes. How are you going to do that?
Well, because they're all the same thing. 200 years of materialist reductionism in science, and I'm a scientist, has not been able to answer the hard question, what is consciousness? For the last century, really, maybe a little longer, since Descartes, I don't know, you can frame it in a lot of ways, since the idea of the ghost in the machine. Most of science has been split between what people call dualism or Unitarianism, not Unitarianism, the church. The idea that the mind and the body are either separate things, or that the body produces consciousness. And the prevailing paradigm in our culture is that consciousness is a result of physiological processes, and that consciousness is resident in your neuroanatomy. It's all within your body, and the worldview that produces what Thomas Kuhn at the Princeton Center for Advanced Studies would call a paradigm, is that each consciousness is independent and unconnected to the others, that consciousness is the result of physiological processes, that consciousness is limited by space-time, which flows from it being entirely a physical process. And that worldview has really been the prevailing worldview for most of science for all of our lifetimes. But what's happening is that in disciplines as widely ranging as physics or biology or medicine, psychology, parapsychology, that the research, even when it's done by people who are deeply committed to the materialist paradigm, has been confronting the fact that the data is telling us something else is going on. And that there is an emerging paradigm that is beginning to come out. It is still not the dominant paradigm, but it is the trend. And you can see it in a number of disciplines. It's in the neurosciences. You can see it in fields that didn't even exist 10 years ago, like quantum biology or resuscitation medicine. You can see it in the data that is produced by people who do, researchers who do non-local consciousness research. There are now 6 paradigms, six protocols. A protocol is basically a scientific ritual. I mean, that upsets people to say that, but it's the truth. And these 6 paradigms, remote viewing, the ability to describe persons, places, or events from which you are separated by reason of time or space or both, that you could not have access to information about based on normal physiological senses. Something called the Ganzfeld protocol, which is basically a kind of remote viewing only under conditions of sensory deprivation. A protocol called presentment, which I will say more about, particularly because it has social implications, in which research shows that just prior to receiving stimulus, a bright light, a picture, a sound, just before it happens, your physiology accommodates for it. Your eyes dilate, the part of the brain that is associated with audio awareness begins to activate. Or in a broader context, something called that began at Princeton called the Global Consciousness Project, done by a psychologist named Roger Nelson, which shows that when some kind of a consuming event occurs that focuses the awareness of large numbers of people, Princess Diana's death, the tsunami in 2011 in Japan, 911, those kinds of events, when those happen, there is really, it sounds very science fiction-y, but there is a flux in the force. What Roger's done is he has random number generators that are scattered all over the planet. This arose out of research that was done at the Princeton Engineering and Anomalies Research Group at Princeton for about 20 years under Bob John, in which they showed that individuals could make random number generators. These are devices which are designed to be random. Nuclear isotopes emitting particles, or complicated electronic algorithms, that kind of thing. They're very carefully designed to be random. That's their whole function. And what they found was that people could change this. And Roger asked the question, well, if that happens at the individual level, could it happen also at the societal level? And so he strung these random number generators all over the planet and wired them all together in a matrix. And lo and behold, when these large, numinous, highly emotionally engaging events occur, these things go non-random. The other, quantum biology, which I'll say some more about, and the near-death research, particularly the research that's now being done in another discipline or sub-discipline of science, which didn't exist 10 years ago, resuscitation medicine, which is now bringing people back from being brain dead for as long as 6 hours later. And these are events that occur in a hospital in which people are very carefully controlled and monitored, and it's become a whole branch of medicine, and there's journals now about it. And also the therapeutic intention research, which is, we know traditionally as healing, but the premise of which is really, can the consciousness of one individual affect the well-being of another person? Now, all of these events, these areas of science, have to be seen in a larger context, and that is the context of creative genius. It's really hard to become a world historical person. Even popes and presidents get lost. I mean, how many people remember Garfield? So it's not easy to become a world historical person. And yet when you look at the biographies, the diaries, the notes, the statements that are made by these people who are world historical people, mostly we know them by one name: Einstein, Planck, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Beethoven, Brahms, those sort of things, those sort of people. What you find is that they all describe this experience of moving into an altered state of consciousness, as Brahms describes it, where the subconscious becomes more dominant than the conscious, and where, as he said, he heard the music, the beats, the chords, the arrangement of the music, just as Beethoven did, just as Mozart did, just as Copland did, and other people, other great composers. You see this in painters, Picasso, for instance, as I said, Leonardo, Michelangelo, all describing this common experience of being in a place where they're in a timeless time, a spaceless space. Max Planck, the father of quantum mechanics, in 1935 said it just very straightforwardly in an interview. For those who may not be familiar with Planck, Planck is the father of quantum mechanics. He is one of the towering physicists of the 20th century, of history. And he said in 1935 that consciousness was primary and that materiality was its manifestation. And then later in 1944 he said in another lecture, I've spent my whole life looking at matter, and I'm here to tell you it doesn't exist. Consciousness is causal. Wolfgang Pauli, another one of the great physicists, says, in the future science will be neither psychic nor physical, but both and neither. Einstein says we are enmeshed in what we call the universe, and in this our consciousness is deluded by what he calls optical delusion. And it is our task to overcome this delusion and to recognize the linkage we have with this greater whole. And then if you look at the great spiritual leaders that we think about, Saint Teresa, Saint John, again, you see this same thing. I mean, this timeless time, this spaceless space. Or if you talk to, if you read material of great psychics like Edgar Cayce, who says essentially exactly the same thing that Brahms says. He says, I'm in an altered state of consciousness, my subconscious becomes dominant, my conscious mind recedes, and in this position, or in this state of consciousness, I am connected with all that is, and I can get information about anything. So when you look at across the spectrum of those individuals we think of as creative geniuses in science or the arts or music, or you look at people that we think of as great spiritual leaders, or you look at people who are explicitly psychics, what you see is that they are all having the same experience, modulated only by context and intention. That is, a scientist is trying to see some fundamental principle, and so that's what they see. A composer is trying to create a piece of music, that's what he sees, or she sees. A painter is trying to create some great visual work of art, that's what happens. Psychics are trying to describe the teacup that's hidden in the closet, that's what happens. So what's clear is that there is an aspect of us that is not limited by space-time. We know from the research that it is as easy to describe things in the past as in the present, or to describe things that are close as things that are far away. And then we have to also look at the near-death research. About 4.2% of the American public has reported a near-death experience. That's about 13 million people. We have 315 million people roughly in the United States. And that's just the people who talk about it. Many people have these experiences, don't talk about them. But the people that talk about them describe exactly the same thing. I am in this place where I am connected with this whole. I feel this sense of oneness with everything. I can get information. I have a perception that there is a part of me that is eternal. Personally, I think that it is this last area of research, the near-death research, that is probably going to tip the paradigm. And the reason is that the resuscitation research is getting so sophisticated, so carefully monitored, that the whole understanding of what constitutes death is changing. And the doctors that do this would be in names you might know, Sam Parnia, who has recently written a book. I mean, there are literally dozens of books out there about near-death experiences. Probably the best known right now is Eben Alexander's Proof of Heaven, but there's my personal favorite is Pim van Lommel's Consciousness Beyond Life, but there's lots of them. Bruce Grayson, Ken Ring, Ray Moody started it with his Life After Life. Although actually the oldest recorded near-death experience we have is in Plato, just as the oldest remote viewing experience that we have recorded is in the 46th chapter of Herodotus. This is in the 5th century BC. Anyway, clearly what's going on is that we are discovering that there is a part of us that exists outside of space-time, that is eternal, as we normally mean this word, and that all life is interconnected and interdependent. And this is, I think, terribly important right now, because we are coming into a period of history in which the world most of us know and grew up in. And I look out across this, a lot of people here about my age or younger, but you know, we're not teenagers. And that world is disappearing. Part of my life is spent doing this consciousness research, and another part is spent looking at trends that are shaping the future. And this is not news per se, it's not epiphenomena. You know, it's not what you see on cable television, which covers mostly, you know, the weirdest things said today. It's very hard to find it in the American corporate media, period. But if you look at these big trends that are coming, climate change, of course, is one of them. The demise of the bees, which is going to have a huge effect on us because of the 90 foodstuffs that humans eat, 70 of them are dependent on the pollination of bees. The demise of pharmaceutical medicine, which is occurring because of the overuse of antibiotics in industrial animal husbandry and agriculture. And as a result of this overuse of antibiotics, the bugs mutate, and they doesn't kill them all, and they mutate, and we are now here seeing the rise of the superbug, which is these things. C. diff is one that you may be familiar with, but there are a number of them, staph infections of various kinds, which simply don't respond. The tuberculosis, there's a new kind of tuberculosis that simply don't respond to antibiotic pharmaceuticals. Now you don't hear about this, but this is a very, very real trend. The failure of our healthcare system. We're now, according to the World Health Organization, 37th, and for instance, a child born in North Carolina has less of a chance of surviving birth and the immediate period thereafter than a child born in Botswana. A child born in Mississippi or Louisiana has about the same chance as a child born in Somalia. So we don't read about this, we don't see it, but these big trends are coming our way. The demise of carbon energy, and of course, yes, water is destiny. If you look at what's going on in California or in the center of the country, you see these terrible droughts that are really threatening the food structure. And the other part of the water is destiny trend is the rise of seawater. And within the next century, most of the cities along America's eastern seaboard will be submerged, as will most of the major European cities. So the world that we grew up in and that we knew is passing away. And our children and their children are going to live in a very, very different world than the one we have. I go into this to make this point. One of the approaches to rectify, remediate what is happening in these major trends, almost all of which are negative, is that by recognizing that all consciousness is interdependent and interactive, we begin to see a pathway where we as ordinary citizens can make a difference. And that's why I agreed to do this dialogue, actually. Because the time frame for the window of opportunity to begin to implement these alternative trends is shrinking very quickly. And it is very important that those of us who are open to these things, and one of the other big trends, of course, is the schism in the country that is occurring between the blue value states and the red value states, which is really independent. It's utterly dependent on politics, but it's not about politics. It's about social policies and the social outcomes which flow from those policies. The infant mortality, for instance, the obesity, the type 2 diabetes. A child in Texas is 4 times more likely to be physically abused by a family member than a child in Vermont. There's this huge schism that's taking place, and you all are aware of it. I mean, you hear about it, you talk to friends that live in other states. This schism that is occurring, which is, as the federal level of the government is gridlocked, really demands some kind of response. And what I am suggesting is that the scientific research that we see in the laboratory has a direct application to the remediating trends that ordinary citizens can create. The reason I picked Pi Global and WIN as the nonprofits to benefit from my talk and from this dialogue is that they represent exactly what we need, which is citizen action begun without any real reference to the government, simply to find a way in which we as individuals can improve the quality of life in our community. When I first moved to Whidbey Island, I looked at, because I'm a researcher, I looked at the social demographics of South Island and North Island, and I looked at the social outcomes. And I was very struck by the fact that North Island has exactly the kind of social outcomes you would expect given its demographics, its economy, the way it's structured. South Island, which is much poorer, the average income down here is $32,000 a year, which for a family of 4 is just slightly above poverty. I mean, very slightly. And so we should be seeing lots of these social disaffections, graffiti, wife beatings, lots of alcoholism problems, premarital pregnancies, and yet when you look at the outcomes, you don't see that. And I was fascinated by that. That's one of the reasons I wanted to move here, because it didn't make any sense. You look at communities all over the United States, and they pretty much agree between their social policies and their social outcomes. They're just what you'd expect. That's not true of South Island.
And that's going to be a segue to the extraordinary aspect of
Well,
life that we're segueing towards, right?
Yes.
Because the trends can take us in a very different direction.
Yeah, no, well, I'm going to stay with this, but I don't mean to go into this too much, but I want you to understand why I think this is important. Because otherwise, all of this stuff about non-local consciousness, I mean, it's very interesting in a sort of abstract way. I don't mean to demean it, I've spent my life studying it, but the question you always come away with is, well, yeah, that's great, but what's its social utility? You know, what is it really telling us? That's the part I'm trying to get to tonight. And what it's telling us is that once you get that all life is interconnected and interdependent, and that these extraordinary events which change our life, you know, these people, as I say, who have one name, and yet in their lifetime they alter the whole history of the human race. These people are all trying to tell us something. And they're very explicit about it. It's not like they keep it a secret. They are telling us that the source of their genius, of their creativity, of their spiritual insight arises from opening to this aspect of consciousness. That's the key to the whole thing. If I could wave a magic wand and get anything I wanted, the thing that I would ask for is that we teach all children to begin meditating in a non-sectarian way when they learn the Pledge of Allegiance, and that we maintain it as a life practice throughout our schools and that businesses allow for it. Because that is probably the best and most powerful way in which you can evoke this part of yourself. The research shows that people who are meditators do better at remote viewing, they do better at healing, they are more creative. As little as 11 hours cumulative of meditation will increase your IQ, it will change the structure of your brain in significant ways. You will sleep better, you will be more creative in your work, you'll be more tolerant of irritations and frustrations, you'll have a better sex life, your memory will improve, your blood pressure will drop. And so this business of extraordinary functioning, which is you know, the creativity, the spiritual epiphanies, the psychic functioning, all of this is one experience, modulated by context and intention. And so there isn't a way to do this. More than that, what we are now discovering is that the ancient spiritual traditions, Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, that these ancient spiritual traditions and the rituals that they develop to open to this part of ourselves are like scientific protocols. And that they are saying the same thing, they're simply saying it using a different language. That what you would get from a Shoshone healer like Rolling Thunder is exactly what you get from a physicist like Max Planck. I mean, one of them may be more detailed in a Western context, but the basic point is the same. We are more than animated meat. And we have the power to change our lives and the lives of our communities. It is not necessary to be powerful as an individual. It is not necessary to be rich. It isn't necessary to be a genius. What is necessary is that you begin to make different small choices. That you choose that which is compassionate and life-affirming. If you are faced with a choice, and if I don't give you anything else tonight that you take away, these two things are important. Develop the daily practice of meditation, however you do it. I have done CDs on this. I will give Craig a paper, he's probably got it, a paper I wrote on how to do this based on the actual research, but if you don't like my way, find another way. It doesn't make any difference. It is that you spend about 20 minutes a day, that's all it takes, developing focused, intentioned awareness. Because the key to opening to the non-local aspect of your consciousness, the source of creativity, the source of insight, lies in being able to sustain in focused, intentioned awareness. That's one thing. And the other thing I would leave you with is that if everybody in this room got up from this dialogue and said, from now on, every decision that I make, I will ask myself, is this compassionate and life-affirming? And if I can't say yes, I won't do it. However seductive it may seem. However profitable it may seem. If I cannot say yes to, is this compassionate and life-affirming? I won't do it. If the people in this room would do that, we could change the world. I'm not kidding. I'm doing a lot of research now on this social aspect of this extraordinary awareness. And what you find out is that little organizations like WIN or Pi Global, you just take Pi Global for a minute, you know, they deal with teenagers, and mostly teenagers in distressed circumstances. Either they come from impoverished countries or they have restricted options. And they give them these techniques for opening to this part of themselves. And they do so as a goal, but without a cherished outcome. And so they don't know how it's going to come out. They simply create the environment in which it can occur. The people that you touch, we know from research that just going into your dry cleaners and smiling and saying, thanks so much, that's a really nice job, that will affect 6 people. Happiness spreads like a virus through a society. And the carriers are the people who wake up. And so what I'm trying to do is infect you all with this concept, because we can make change. Now, I can go into great detail about the specifics of these extraordinary experiences, and I'm sure Craig's got lots of questions for me. But that's really that's why I'm here tonight, that's what I'm trying to say. We have the power to make change. And there is a desperate need that we do so. That's it. Okay, so you got questions, I'm sure.
I do. So, it's lovely just because I had a similar conversation, thanks to you, with Larry Dossi when I got to interview Larry, and another amazing book is his book, One Mind. Why there's a greater consciousness and why it matters, and basically how we're all connected, very much paralleling Stephen's point of view and what he spoke. So I'd like to speak to that part of, okay, if we have this same connection to a greater consciousness that shows up, like you said in the title, religious epiphany, awakening a feeling of connection with near-death experience, awakening of connection within a healing context. Do you think that it has ebbed and flowed through history? Is it a time that it seems to be resurrecting, as for example, as you say, meditation science is just enormous right now. It's everywhere. Does it seem like this kind of greater consciousness awakens through periods in your perception? Have you
That's
seen
a
that?
really interesting question.
I just made it up.
Well, actually, there's some very interesting research that addresses that. A young German researcher named Suthbert Egbert, S-U-I-T-B-E-R-T-E-G-B-E-R-T. And he's been looking at not just this issue, but another one which is related, and that is the effects of solar activity and its effects on the geomagnetic biosphere. And he argues, he's been looking at, for instance, the number of patents issued. Very interesting. And he finds that when the sun is calm and quiet and the biosphere is undisturbed, that there are more patents. He actually argues that the Enlightenment and the Renaissance are directly correlated with this. Now, why would that be true? And the answer is sort of an extension of what I've been saying, and that is that we don't live on the earth, we live in the earth. There are a couple hundred miles of biosphere up above us. Now we know from research, and there are literally thousands of papers, that everything from frogs to tree rings to our ability to open to non-local consciousness is strongly influenced by the fluctuations in the geomagnetic field. You know, the sun emits particles and they strike the magnetosphere and cause distortions in the magnetosphere. And by metaphor, it's roughly like, I couldn't use this metaphor if the average age of the audience was 20, but it's like holding a magnet against a cathode ray television tube. And I'm sure at some point in your life you held a magnet and it made the screen go all strange, and right? Well, it's like that. There is a shift in the geomagnetic field. These they're like veils. It's as if the earth is protected by these veils of the geomagnetic field. And as the solar particles strike them, when the veils become very perturbed, then it's harder to open to this aspect of consciousness. And we know this from experimental work. We've done lots of, for instance, remote viewing, where we ask people to describe things that they couldn't possibly know, and we find that it's not a huge difference, but it's a very real difference. That when the field is perturbed, that it's harder to do it than when the field is calm. And so we live in the earth, and we are influenced by these fluctuations, as is every living being. Tree rings, frogs, flowers, marine life, birds, human beings, all influenced by this. And so there clearly is an association with the capacity of a society to make leaps that correlates calm solar activity with creative leaps. That's part of it. The other part of it is, I think there is a urgent and powerful need to find a way through. I said earlier about the presentment research. Now, here's a presentment experiment. You're staring at a screen, a monitor screen, television monitor. And it's just black. And there's a random number generator that controls the feed to the monitor. And on the basis of a random event generator, so nobody knows when it's going to happen, a picture will appear. And sometimes the picture is sort of bland and banal, and sometimes it's very emotionally affecting. It's highly sexual or highly violent, or very emotionally, very tender. And what they discover in the research is that just before you have the stimulus, they have a camera, a macro camera that's looking at the iris of your eye. This is all, by the way, peer-reviewed published research. Everything I'm telling you is you can find in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. Just before you actually see the picture, the macro camera reveals that your eye dilates in anticipation. It's called a presentiment. And, more than that, the more numinous, that is, the more emotionally affecting the picture is, the more the dilation. Another protocol is you're sitting in a lab and you have earphones on and you hear this low level of white noise like that. And again, a random number generator controls it, and periodically a loud sound occurs. And again, the strength of the stimulus, in this case, the loudness of the sound, just prior to whatever the stimulation is, that the part of your brain that deals with auditory reception lights up a little bit, and depending on the loudness of the sound, it lights up more.
What is the time difference you're talking about?
It's about 0.3 of a second. Roger Nelson's experiment that I mentioned earlier at some detail, Roger's looking not at a different kind of presentment. And that correlates to when people learn about some massively affecting emotional event. And so between the individual presentment research that's done in the lab, that's just about an individual. But when you have millions of people who are exposed to some kind of stimulus, just prior to the stimulus occurring, and as they discover it, as it comes online, as it were, there is this shift. These random number generators go non-random. But more than that, it's telling us that at this non-local level of consciousness, we are all connected. Now, if you look, for instance, in therapeutic intention research, well, here's an experiment. It's done by a woman named Jean Ochterberg. It's just been replicated about 2 weeks ago. So this is a really very solid experiment now. This would be the third replication. Jean, who was a lovely woman who just died recently, was studying kahuna priests in Hawaii. And she assigned the kahuna priests to healees, people who were going to receive healing. And she put them in MRIs and did fMRI studies. And it's the same basic kind of protocol. There's a random number generator, and there was a little light, and when the light went on, the healers were to send healing, and when the light went off, they stopped. And what she discovered was, and what this has now been replicated, was that during the period of therapeutic intention, a particular part of their brain, it's always the same part, has to do with the cingulate area, lights up. But it only happens when they're the subject of therapeutic intention. There's another series of experiments called staring experiments, which we've all experienced sort of in the field. You drive up to a stoplight and you just have a sense that somebody's staring at you and you turn and there's somebody staring at you. Well, in the staring experiments that were begun by a guy named William Browd, William had one person sitting in a room with a television monitor that was just had white noise, you know, just this sort of psh noise, visual. And then periodically, that was hooked up to a video camera in another room, and when the random number generator told somebody to stare at your picture, and only when they stared at your picture, there was a change in your brain function. That is, you were aware you were being stared at. And these, by the way, I need to say something about these experiments. It's not just that they're published in the peer-reviewed literature. These protocols have now been replicated in the tens of thousands of times. I mean, in remote viewing and therapeutic intention, which are my special areas, I mean, in remote viewing, there are millions of remote viewing sessions. I tested 23,000 people, so, I mean, there are just literally millions of these experiments. The probability that these experiments are happening by chance is better than 1 in a billion. In fact, in some cases, Roger's experiment, it's better than 1 in 100 billion. Now, to give you a sense of the
probability is better than, or
that it would happen by chance.
Okay.
The probability that this is happening by chance is 1 in a billion. 1 in 20 is the level of significance. To give you a context for that, the Higgs boson particle that was just recently discovered was pronounced to be real on the basis of 1 in 300 million. So these are better than 1 in a billion results. So although the effect is not huge, that is, the individual effect of a given experiment is not huge, and to give you a context of that, it is still larger than you would expect. Jessica Utz, who's the chairman of the Department of Statistics and Mathematics at UC Irvine, did a study comparing these effects that I'm discussing with the 81 milligram aspirin effect. And I suspect most of the men in this room probably most of us are taking 81 milligram aspirins, right? I take one, you take one, right? Most of us do. It's a ironclad part of cardiovascular therapies in the United States. Take these 81 milligram, these child aspirins. Actually, the effect of the aspirin is much smaller than the effect of these experiments. They are it's a much larger effect size. That is, it happens more frequently, it has a bigger effect on more individuals. So there's so much misinformation about this extraordinary performance stuff that you're constantly reading in the papers about the denier stuff, that it's very hard to get the actual data. But the actual data, when you look at it, is that every one of these protocols has better than 1 in a billion, that it's not happening by chance.
So here's the thing I always find fascinating, is on one hand we think, the perception, is that if science shows it to be true, then it's accepted. The illusion. And it is, the paradigm is that way, that when research shows some things to be true, we accept it, and I know you more than anybody knows that that's false.
Well,
So when you speak to, for example, the resuscitation paradigm that we're starting to see in resuscitation medicine, being the way, why would you expect that, given all the research and the thousands of studies that we have that show psychic phenomenon, remote viewing phenomenon, presentiment, and all the other things we're talking about, therapeutic intention, why do you think that the near-death work may shift the tide for acceptance, that may open this science finally being looked at with a balanced point of view?
also a good question. Well, the reason I think the near-death research is going to be the one that tips it is that it's a personal experience that's not abstract. You know, if I ask you to describe where Craig is going to be in an hour, And you do that, and I can tell you that if I ask everybody in this audience to describe in detail, where Craig was going to be in an hour, and describe if he was inside or outside, and what the room looked like, and what colors were there, and what was being said, and you'd be able to do it. About 12% of you would do very well, and another 12% would do pretty well, and about 12% wouldn't get it on any given experiment. Now, they might get it another time, so those things seem abstract to people. But as you know, if you've ever talked to somebody who's had a near-death experience, just out of curiosity, how many people in this room have had a near-death experience? Anybody? Oh my goodness gracious. You see, when I tell you that over 13 million people in the United States have it, you can see that those experiences are very powerful, and the people who talk about them to their friends and family, that's very compelling testimony. Also, the fact that it is occurring, particularly the new near-death work. The original near-death work was about getting stories from people who had had experiences in the past. Those are retrospective studies. The new studies are prospective studies. That is, they occur mostly in hospitals when you are under careful monitoring. And by monitoring, I don't just mean brain waves. It is much more sophisticated than that. They're looking at blood gases and all sorts of things. These prospective studies occur when people are in a hospital setting, everything is controlled, they know exactly what's going on in your body, and yet when you come back, you report. Pim van Lommel's favorite story that he told me is they brought a guy back, and then they ask people when they bring them back, what happened? Well, a lot of people say nothing happened, but a significant number of them say things like this man. He said, well, you know, I got out of my body, and I was kind of looking around, and nobody seemed to be able to hear me or pay any attention to me, and I realized I didn't have my teeth. So I went down the hall to my hospital room to get my teeth, and there was a nurse, and he describes the nurse, and she was taking the teeth and putting them in a box and putting them on a shelf in the nurse's station. Now that's a timed, stamped event. That is, they know exactly when this happened. The nurse makes a log of it. And so they could exactly correlate that this man had no brain activity, and yet he was able to describe, like a remote viewer, in great detail, something that was happening while he was clinically dead. And the prospective studies, and particularly the prospective studies with this new resuscitation technology, where the time in which people are out expands. 6 hours is not a number I pulled out of my hat. It's actually based on a couple of studies that were done, and I understand, I have not read the paper yet, but I understand they're now up to 8 hours. So as long as they keep you, they keep your heart going, and they lower your temperature, but they keep your blood moving and everything, and they bring you back. And when they bring these people back, they tell these, not all of them, but many of them tell these stories, which can be time-stamped. And I think that becomes so dramatically overpowering that that's what's going to tip it, much more than an abstraction like, well, a study that I did, for instance, in which I had healers do healing, and while they were doing the healing, we had little sealed vials of water, very special water that was made of extreme purity, made out of the gases. A 5-minute bottle, a 10-minute bottle, a 15-minute bottle. And we found that when they were doing the healing, they changed the molecular structure of the water. Now that, for me, was very dramatic. I was really very dramatic. But For most people, that's, you used infrared spectrophotometry, what's that? And it changed what? A certain wave number? Very hard to get. That's a different story then. I went down the hall to get my teeth. So, I think what's happening is that this research is piling up. What's interesting about it is that, science is not a thing. It's really a series of silos in which, if you read the literature, physicians don't quote physicists, don't cite physicists very often. Physicists don't cite physicians. Physicians don't...
More and more, though.
Huh?
They are more and more, though.
They don't cite biologists. Each of these disciplines is developing its own literature on this subject. But when you look across sort of the meta view of it, what you find out is that these people are all independently coming to the same conclusions. For instance, in quantum biology, a field that didn't exist 10 years ago, the quantum biologists are now saying, well, life is a quantum process. Cells are, the processes of cells are governed in part by quantum principles, and that what is going on, this is not a theory, this is a physical measurement, is that each cell in your body is moving down its own timeline into the future, looking at the options that it has available to it, collapsing the vector of its choice, and then living into it. And so literally every cell in your body is involved in this process. These silos are beginning to connect at the top. And just as this lady said, you're beginning to see quantum biologists talking about physicians, talking about physicists, because it's beginning to occur that the research the data simply points in a particular direction. Now the thing about paradigms is that the first presumption is that science is in search of one absolute truth. That is not true. Thomas Kuhn wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolution, which I commend to you. It's probably the most important book about science written in the 20th century. Courses are taught at universities all over the world about this book. Most people who are not in science don't know anything about it, but Kuhn, who was at the Princeton Center for Advanced Studies, his basic point is that the function of a paradigm is to define an area in which what he calls normal science can be carried out. And the task is not to make breakthroughs, but instead to fill in the blocks within it's like filling in, my wife does these Sudoku things, and it's like filling in the blocks in the Sudoku puzzle. That's normal science, and that's what most people do. It's very interesting to note that the first tier scientists, the guys who we know by one name, they're all very clear about non-local consciousness and the role of consciousness. It's the second and third tier scientists that have a hard time because their careers are tied up in the paradigm and in solving the problems that the paradigm defines. Now what happens is, as Kuhn describes this, is that anomalies begin to accumulate, things that can't be explained. And so what happens in the science, the disciplines that are experiencing these anomalies, is that they try to extend theory to encompass them. And that works for a while. Or they just put it aside and say, well, we can't answer that now, but we'll get to it. But eventually, you get to a point where the anomalies accumulate. They're kind of like the wolves around the campfire in the wilderness. And they just build up and become very threatening. Wolves are actually, I like wolves, so maybe that's not a good metaphor, but in any case, they become very threatening, and the paradigm goes into crisis. And as Kuhn points out, these crises throw everything into doubt because you don't quite know what the barriers are anymore, what the boundaries are anymore. And then, as he points out, and he gives descriptions, the Copernican revolution, for instance, it amazes me, en passant, to note that 25% of the American public is not aware that the Earth goes around the sun. That's another trend, the rise of the new dark ages. It's very serious. I mean, you look at American public schools, the creationists are working day and night to get the textbooks. They are anti-science. But let me finish the thought and I'll go back to that. But so what happens is the paradigm goes into crisis. That's about where we are now. It's beginning to move into crisis. And when crisis occurs, as Kuhn points out, the thing which resolves it and allows a new paradigm to emerge is not adding another brick on the wall, but a leap that goes into the unknown, something that nobody thought of, that was not just a linear extension of the logic of the existing paradigm, but some whole new thing. And he describes these people who have these breakthroughs, and he makes the point that he uses words like the scales fall from their eyes. They suddenly the light goes on and they suddenly see this thing that they never saw before. Exactly the words that the Plancks and the Paulis and the Mozarts and the Coplands and blah, blah, all have. So we're at a point where the crisis is beginning to build up because the research simply cannot encompass materialism as a paradigm, is unable to encompass the phenomena that are observed. And that's something that's going to happen in most of our lifetimes, I think.
So when you bring it back, the enigma that I love about any discussion with you is, I don't want to say where science and non-science meet, because that doesn't quite get it. But it's almost like the passion for the research and the passion for the science to expose phenomenon I see and feel from you all the time, and yet at the same time there's this knowing that, for example, taking quantum mechanics, the moment I observe this, it alters it. So how can I really study it anyway? There's like that duality of
Right.
to the best that we can, but we really can't. Can you kind of address where those
Sure.
two meet? I know you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do. Well, this happened for me when I was a young man, in my early 20s. I worked for National Geographic. And one of the stories that I did for them was the rock art of the Bushman. And in order to do this, I decided that I needed to actually meet a Bushman. I'd spend time with Bushmen because I could look at the art, but I couldn't get what was going on. And so they authorized me to do that and arranged for that. And in preparation for this trip, I went around and talked, this is 1961, I think, 62. I went around and talked to all the anthropologists that I could find in Washington, D.C., who were specialists in this. And they all gave me what I came to think of as the little brown brother lecture. These people are primitives, they have no sense of property, they're just very primitive, they have no sense of time, they live in these little family groups, they just grub stuff out, and the whole take was the little brown brother syndrome. That's the way I came to think of it. So I was, in those days, I was very cocky about the fact that I taught survival skills and I could exist in the wild and all that sort of thing. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to have any problem. I'll just go out there, and I got all my gear together, and everything. Anyway, I flew into Johannesburg, and then I caught this little bush plane, out to this station, and this was in what it was then Southwest Africa, it's now Namibia. And then I got in a Range Rover and we went out into the Kalahari Desert, which is not a Sahara desert. It's more like if you've ever been down in California, like Joshua Tree or something like that. So there we are, I'm bouncing along in this guy's thing, and we come out in the middle of nowhere, we stop. Okay. And then we just sort of sitting there, and out of the bush comes this little family group, 8 or 9 individuals, only one of whom spoke any English. And the guy said something to the man who spoke a little English. Okay, I'll come back and get him in about 8 days. And he turned around and drove away. So there I am with all my gear on my back, right? I'm 6'2½". These people are about 5 feet, right? All these little people. They have nothing on. The men have these little penal sheaths. The women have stidophagia, great buttocks. They're not Bantus, they're not blacks, they're a kind of yellowish color, they're their own race. So off we go, and I'm walking along with these people. And within an hour, I knew that it was a great courtesy for them to take me because I was such a klutz that I was literally endangering their lives. I was a buffalo in a tea shop. Anyway, we go along, and about the 3rd day, I'm getting really hungry, and I had brought food because I had read that they eat grubs and things, and eating beetles is just not on my list. I know I watch Anthony Bourdain, he'll eat anything. But I draw the line at beetles. I just, those little guys crawling in, couldn't do it. Anyway, so I've got my food, and I'm getting hungry. And I look at my watch, and this John, and they have a click language like that, and he says to me, "That is a beautiful slave bracelet." I said, "Oh no, that's not oh my God." Anyway, I spent time with, the days, it was an extraordinary experience. Obviously, I've never forgotten it. What I got from that, which is the answer to your question, is I learned there are a lot of ways to be a human being. There is no best way. There is no one way. There are a lot of ways to be a human being. It depends on what your priorities are. And these people, although they didn't have any property or anything, they were happy. They were in an altered state of consciousness a large part of the time. They had wonderful, close familial relationships. And by all of the sort of fundamental human drive issues, they were successful. So there are a lot of ways to be a human being, and our way, and science, is a way, not the way. And one of the things, that your point is, what I have gotten out of years of research, both in terms of the hard science, experimental science, and also because I'm the last living founder of the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness of the American Anthropological Association. I got very interested in the early 70s and have remained interested since then with shamanism and ancient spiritual traditions of all kinds. Some of them I know much better than others. My knowledge of Hindu is not very great, for instance, but I've had a lot of interaction with various Native American tribes, and I have read a great deal, and I've met a lot of shamans all over the world. And is that I came to realize a number of years ago, and nothing I have seen subsequently has contradicted it, is that science is a kind of ritual, actually. It's a form of shamanism. We know, for instance, that although the presumption is that two scientists doing exactly the same experiment using exactly the same materials ought to get exactly the same result, but they don't. We know, for instance, in the placebo research, that the belief that the physician who is administering the medication, whether he believes it's a, he doesn't, he's blind to whether it's a drug or whether it's the sugar pill, but his belief in the efficacy of the drug has an effect on the outcome of both the drug and the placebo. We know that observer effects of all kinds create variations in the outcomes of experiments. We don't acknowledge it a lot, but it's true, and it's there. We also know that we have the power, that's what the placebo research is telling us, is that we have the power to control our bodies down to the cellular level. I mean, if it wasn't true, placebo wouldn't work. And placebo shows us that any given placebo study, and there are thousands of them, any drug trial, between 35 and 40% of the people who get the sugar pill will do as well or better than the people who get the medication. Now, if I was doing a study on the Isles of Langerhorn, for instance, or something, some obscure part of the body, most people wouldn't even know where it was or what it did, even if they did know. And yet, if we did a study in which half the people got the placebo, and half the people got the sugar pill, the people that got the placebo, even though they don't know what that part of the body that this drug is supposed to affect does, would in fact get 35 to 40% of them would in fact get a result that is as good or better than the people who got the drug. And in fact, there's a guy named Irving Kirsch who's been doing research on placebos and medication for antidepressants, and he's published paper after paper. And basically the takeaway is that the difference between the medication and the placebo is within error bars. So that, in fact, it's such a strong correlation that he did a study after they criticized him in which he gave everybody little bottles that said placebo, no active ingredient. And then he said to them, but 35 to 40% of you who are taking the sugar pill will get results that are as good or better than the people would get if they took the drug, and by God they did. Even though they knew they were taking a placebo. And Irv Kirsch's work has been published all over the place and very well known. So I think the takeaway is what the Bushman taught me, and that is there are a lot of ways to be a human being. Our way is a way. And that the insights that have developed over empirical observation over thousands of years are just as real and powerful as the insights that we develop in the laboratory. And just to give you a specific on this, one of the last things I did before I left Geographic, I was doing a piece on Egypt and Egyptian medicine and other things. And I got these three papyri, the Ebers, Smith, and Kuhn papyri, which are very famous medical papyri that were found and were translated at the early decades of the 20th century. And in the book that I was reading up at the Library of Congress, reading about these papyri, it said, there was a sentence and it said, if you want to know if a woman is pregnant, have her urinate on a flaxen bag with wheat and barley in it. And if the seeds germinate, she's pregnant, and if more barley seeds than wheat, it's going to be a girl, and more wheat than barley, it'll be a boy. And the commentary by the archaeologist was, this is a typical example of magical thinking that arose in the Egyptian, blah, 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 right? And I read this, and I thought, no. Nobody would write that who didn't have a direct knowledge about it. You wouldn't make it up. And so I went looking in medical literature. And if you read the medical literature, the Western medical literature, prior to the development of broad spectrum antibiotics, you get all this holistic stuff that was going on. Before they discovered antibiotics, they were looking at hot springs and manipulation and massage and oils, all sorts of things. Anyway, so I'm down at the National Medical Library, and I'm looking for this stuff to see if I can find, and I find this paper, and I'll probably get some of the labs mixed up. But anyway, the first paper I come across, if I remember correctly, is a Swiss paper. And it said, we wanted to design a study that would see whether we could develop a pregnancy test. And so we thought, with the recent discovery by a group of Americans about a substance that's in the urine of pregnant women but not in non-pregnant women, we thought that that might affect the germination of seeds. And so we tried that, and lo and behold, we discovered that when pregnant women, the urine of pregnant women caused the seeds to germinate to a higher degree than the seeds of non-pregnant women. Okay, so then I keep looking and I come across another paper, and this one's from a lab like Portugal. And it says, we read the Swiss paper and the American paper, and we thought, well, maybe the seeds make a difference. And so we tried all kinds of seeds, and we discovered that barley and wheat worked the best. And more than that, it specifies gender. Keep looking. These are all papers published in the 30s, right? Late 20s, early 30s. And so then I keep going, and then I find another paper, which I think was Hungarian, and it said, you know, we read the Swiss paper and the Portuguese paper and the American paper, and we thought, well, this is very interesting, but it's awfully messy. And so maybe we could put the seeds in something, and that would help. And so we tried all kinds of bags made out of various things, and we discovered that flaxen bags are the best bags. And so what you have in a series of Western medical journals is confirmation of an empirical observation that developed 2,500 years earlier. More than that. There are lots of these stories. We need to respect indigenous knowledge, because things which are observed over thousands of years and passed down, particularly in cultures that operate on the basis of oral history, where they learn very carefully. You know, the founders, the Masons in the beginning, I don't know how many people here may be Masons, but the Masons make you memorize the rituals, word for word. And the reason is because they understood about oral traditions, that if you have to memorize it word for word and you have to get it letter perfect and you pass it on to the next generation, maybe a lot of the people in between, they don't understand what it means, but periodically somebody awakens to what that means. And oral traditions, one of the functions anthropologically of oral traditions is to pass down empirical observation, letter perfect, from generation to generation, because periodically somebody looks at it and says, oh my goodness, well if we did this, and then it gets altered slightly, and then it gets passed down that way. And in that way, indigenous peoples develop a corpus of scientific knowledge. And so we need to not be condescending to the indigenous peoples. We need to remember my experience of the Bushmen. That's a wonderful slave bracelet.
And with that, thank you.
Thank you.